It is straight up not going to happen. There is not going to be an agreement by Friday. Like, the deadline is then. They can keep pushing the deadlines. It doesn't matter. It literally does not matter. The deadline makes no difference at all. And people are like, oh, why would they not go on strike? Going on strike makes no difference. Like, all the going on strike does is...
3 days before the deadline, and here's what nobody's saying out loud. This Friday deadline is completely meaningless. The players know it. The owners know it. And the fact that we're still pretending it matters tells you everything about where these CBA negotiations actually stand. Because what you just heard isn't pessimism. It's reality based on how this process has been playing out for months.
The league aren't taking players that seriously, and we've heard plenty of times the league's being like, oh, these players don't really know business. These players are basically these players are completely delusional. They don't have a clue what's going on. And then it doesn't help when you have Fee basically being like, saying almost an equivalent of, I know business.
That's the uncomfortable truth that's been hanging over these negotiations since day one. The league isn't taking the players seriously, and when you've got ownership groups looking at the WNBPA's proposals and literally saying these players don't understand business, you've got a fundamental credibility problem. But here's where it gets more complicated, because some of the players aren't helping their own cause.
When, based on scale, it's like saying you know how to run. You could run a supermarket because you ran a successful lemonade stand. That's the scale equivalent of unrivaled to the WNBA. And that is just going to, all that does is it strengthens the owners' argument of these players are fucking delusional.
Nafisa Collier, running unrivaled, doesn't make her qualified to negotiate a multi-billion-dollar media rights deal. That's not a knock on what she's built. It's just scale. And when players point to unrivaled as evidence, they understand the business side. It actually strengthens the owner's argument. Because the gap between running a 3-on-3 startup league and negotiating revenue sharing for a league with NBA ownership backing is massive. The owners hear that comparison, and it confirms exactly what they already think.
And maybe if Nafisa Collier or Satu Sabali or somebody who just despises Cathy, like Satu Sabali has been calling out Cathy publicly for years. Like, the fact is that the only people that are being combative now are the people that just hate Cathy, which is completely fair, by the way. Like, I mean, I would say the ownership of the WNBA and a lot of people that are involved, and a lot of those private equity people are fucking nightmares.
But here's what's changed in the last 6 weeks. The language has shifted. 6 weeks ago, players were using phrases like slap in the face to describe the league's offers. Now you've got Breanna Stewart saying she thinks a deal will get done. That's not a small shift in tone. When your most prominent players move from openly hostile to cautiously optimistic, something's happening behind closed doors. The players who are still being combative publicly, look at who they are. Natasha Cloud has been calling out Cathy Engelbert for years. This isn't new ground for her. When the only voices still publicly fighting are the ones who already had personal issues with league leadership, that tells you the broader player base is moving toward acceptance.
Extension. I think we see one more extension for 6 weeks because everybody, like, they all know that a strike is completely performative. That if they strike and it turns out that, like, all that means if they strike now is that between now and when the deal gets done, any player that's rehabbing with their teams, any player that is working out with their teams and not at an off-season league, any player that's basically just sticking with their team can't. They're done. Like, I don't know off the top of my head who is working.
And that's the calculation every player has to make right now. Going on strike before the season starts is purely performative. Everyone knows it. A strike in February doesn't cost the league a single game. It doesn't impact revenue. It doesn't create real leverage. All it does is prevent players from working out with their teams and rehabbing injuries with team facilities. Think about someone like Caitlin Clark. She's in Indiana right now, working with the Fever's training staff. Aaliyah Boston is rehabbing there. If the players vote to strike on Friday, what actually happens? Those players can't use team facilities anymore. That's it. The draft still happens in April. The season still starts in May. Nothing changes except the optics.
The players can walk. But like the players going on strike now and the season not missing a game is just irrelevant, and it's completely performative. And everybody around knows that. The players know that. The teams know that. The league knows that. Everybody knows that a strike prior to the draft is completely performative. And I do think we will see a situation where this gets resolved by St. Patrick's Day. St. Patrick's Day, 17th of March. That sounds like a date, because you also have to take into account that it becomes harder to solve this when everyone's out Unrivaled. When a lot of people are out Unrivaled, it becomes harder to solve this.
The real deadline isn't Friday. It's not even about the draft on April 15th. The actual deadline is whenever free agency needs to open to give teams enough time to build rosters before training camp. And that means this thing can drag into mid-March without causing any real problems. Here's how the timeline probably plays out. Unrivaled's championship game is March 4th. Give the players 2 weeks after that to focus entirely on CBA negotiations without the distraction of game schedules. That puts you at March 17th, St. Patrick's Day. That's when a deal gets announced. Then you've got the expansion draft a few days later. Free agency opens April 1st, and you're into the regular draft on April 15th with everything ready to go. It's compressed, but it's workable, and both sides know it.
And then they're going to open free agency 2 days later. 48 hours later, they're going to open free agency. And actually, no, they're going to have to do the expansion draft first. Fuck, the expansion draft might be 48 hours later, and then free agency might be the 1st of April. So free agency being on the 1st of April means that like you've got 2 weeks before the draft for free agency, and then you're into the draft and you're ready to go. It becomes a bit of a shit one, but you're ready to go. So yeah, that's my theory. I don't think,
because here's what's really driving this toward resolution. Legacy. No player wants to be remembered as the person who shut down the WNBA in its breakthrough moment. Not after the Caitlin Clark effect brought unprecedented attention to the league. Not after attendance records were shattered across the board. Not after major media deals were signed based on projected growth. If this season doesn't happen because of a player strike, that becomes the defining moment of everyone's career who was involved in the negotiations. That's not a legacy anyone wants. And the players understand that pressure far better than the owners do, which is exactly why the owners have more leverage than they should.
These players aren't dumb. Not only, like, whatever, and even if you want to say they're dumb, they're not. Like, if you are responsible for shutting down the WNBA, that will be your legacy, which will be a disaster, which will set women's sports back 75 years at this point in time. There's genuinely, the only way now this could work is if the players had Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese on their side, and Nike. You would have to have Nike, Under Armour, Nike, Reebok, whatever these big, realistically just Nike at the end of the day, because they're the ones that really have the power in the shoe game. If Caitlin, Sabrina, Aja Wilson.
This is the scenario that would actually give players real leverage if you could get Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, Aja Wilson, Brianna Stewart, Sabrina Ionescu, and Paige Barkers to all band together and say we're starting our own league with NBA owners who want a separate project, with Nike backing, with arenas already secured in 8 cities, with a fantasy draft for all existing WNBA players who want to join. That would be real leverage, but that's not happening. It's never going to happen. Because the players who have the most to lose from a shutdown, the ones with the biggest endorsement deals and the most mainstream recognition, are the exact players who can't afford to be associated with blowing up the league. Their brand value is tied directly to the WNBA's success.
By St. Patrick's Day. St. Patrick's Day, 17th of March. That sounds like a date, because you also have to take into account that it becomes harder to solve this when everyone's out Unrivaled. When a lot of people are out Unrivaled, it becomes harder to solve this. The positive thing is that Unrivaled takes a break between Tuesday and Friday every week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and they can try sort that out. But at the end of the day, when does Unrivaled end? So Unrivaled ends on the 4th of March.
And that's why this deadline extension isn't a crisis. It's a negotiating tactic that everyone sees through. The players extend the deadline to show they're still fighting. The owners extend the deadline because they're not feeling any real pressure yet. And both sides keep talking because neither side actually wants this to fall apart. The question isn't whether a deal gets done. The question is how much the players have to give up to get there. So let's talk about what's actually on the table and why this is taking so long to resolve. Because the gap between what the players want and what the owners are offering isn't just about money. It's about fundamental disagreements over how to value the league's future growth. The players want revenue sharing tied to the new media deals. They're looking at the NBA's model, where players get roughly 50% of basketball-related income, and they're asking why the WNBA should be different. The league's response has been consistent. You can't compare the two leagues, because the WNBA still isn't profitable on its own. Most teams are subsidized by their NBA counterparts. The infrastructure investment is ongoing, and tying player compensation to revenue sharing before the league is actually generating consistent profit is a risk the owners aren't willing to take. But here's where the players have a legitimate argument. The new media rights deals that were just signed, the expanded playoff format, the addition of Golden State as a 13th franchise, the unprecedented attention from Caitlin Clark's rookie season. All of that represents real value that didn't exist in the last CBA negotiation. The players are saying, we deserve to benefit from that growth, and they're not wrong. The problem is quantifying exactly how much of that growth is sustainable versus how much was a one-year spike. Because that's the real question hanging over everything. Was this past season an anomaly or a new baseline? If Caitlin Clark's impact on ratings and attendance continues, if Angel Reese and the other rookies maintain their popularity, if the league can build on this momentum, then the players' projections for future revenue make sense. But if this was a temporary surge that regresses toward the mean, then the owners' more conservative approach is justified, and neither side actually knows the answer yet. You can't predict whether Caitlin Clark will have the same cultural impact in year 2. You can't guarantee that casual fans who tuned in out of curiosity will become regular viewers. You can't assume that attendance will stay at record levels once the novelty wears off. So you've got players negotiating based on optimistic projections, and owners negotiating based on historical precedent, and the gap between those two perspectives is enormous. That's why the strike threat rings hollow. Because if the players actually follow through and shut down the season, they never get to prove their projections were correct. They never get to demonstrate that last year wasn't a fluke. They never get to build on the momentum that's supposed to justify their demand. A strike doesn't give them leverage. It destroys the very foundation of their argument. The owners know this. That's why they're comfortable letting deadlines pass. That's why they're not rushing to meet the players' demands. Because time is on their side. Every day that passes without a deal is another day closer to the point where the players have to choose between accepting less than they want or canceling the season and proving the owners right about the league's actual value. And that's the calculation that's happening right now, behind closed doors. The players are trying to figure out the absolute minimum they can accept and still call it a win. The owners are trying to figure out the absolute maximum they can offer without setting a precedent they'll regret in the next negotiation. And both sides are waiting for the other to blink first. What makes this particularly frustrating for fans is that both sides have legitimate points, but neither side is being fully transparent about their actual bottom lines. The players talk about respect and equity, which sounds good publicly but doesn't translate into specific contract language. The owners talk about financial sustainability and long-term viability, which sounds responsible but conveniently ignores how much profit the NBA ownership groups are making from their WNBA investments through other revenue streams. The reality is that WNBA teams might not be profitable on a pure basketball operations basis, but they provide significant value to their parent organizations through tax benefits, facility utilization, community goodwill, and cross-promotional opportunity. When you account for those factors, the financial picture looks very different than what the owners present in negotiations. But those benefits are hard to quantify and even harder to build into a CBA structure. So where does this actually end? Most likely with a compromise that gives the players meaningful salary increases and some form of revenue sharing with caps and triggers that protect the owners from downside risk. The players get to say they won revenue sharing in principle. The owners get to maintain financial controls that limit their actual exposure. And both sides get to claim victory while knowing they'll be right back at this table in 5 or 6 years fighting over the same issues. The question for fans is whether that's good enough. Because what the league really needs isn't just a CBA that avoids a strike. It's a CBA that positions the WNBA for sustainable growth without another crisis negotiation next time around. And based on how this process has played out, with missed deadlines and public posturing and fundamental disagreements over basic financial realities, there's not much reason for optimism that this deal, whenever it finally gets done, will actually solve the underlying problem. But it will get done. Probably around March 17th, probably with both sides claiming they got what they needed, and probably with enough ambiguity built in that we'll be having this exact same conversation again in 20. Because that's how these negotiations always end. Not with real resolution, but with temporary compromise that kicks the hard decisions down the road. So when you see that announcement in a few weeks, when the players and the league put out their joint statement about a historic agreement and a new era for the WNBA, remember what you saw here. Remember that this deadline was meaningless. Remember that the strike threat was performative. Remember that both sides knew exactly how this would play out from the beginning. And ask yourself whether that's really the foundation you want for the league's future growth. Because if the WNBA is going to reach its potential, it needs players and owners who actually trust each other enough to build something sustainable together. And based on everything we've seen in these negotiations, that trust doesn't exist yet. Maybe this next CBA will start to build it, but more likely, it'll just set up the next fight.